thank you everybody for joining us. This is one of the, for us involved in the review of Irish studies in Europe and Rise Journal, these are the among the happiest days when we're celebrating the publication of a new issue. And that's certainly the case with this issue, Remapping Irish Literary and Cultural Landscapes in the Mid-20th Century. It's my huge privilege as the general editor of Rise to be able to begin this session, and I'll be handing over very, very shortly to the editors of this issue, Yen-Chi Wu and Phyllis Boumans, who will be talking a little bit more detail about the issue and introducing those contributors who've been kind enough to join us here today to talk about their contribution to the issue. So I'm just going to say a few very brief words about our journal, about what our mission is, and maybe some thank yous to people who make the journal possible, I guess, and a continuing concern. So we're an international open access, peer-reviewed, multidisciplinary journal, and we bring together articles and reviews in the broader field of Irish studies. So we welcome contributions, and not just in literature, but we've had contributions in the visual arts, from film to fine art to indeed, in this issue, we have a contribution on radio, as we've had before, and the audiovisual area more broadly, on history and politics. Really the broader kind of arts, humanities, social science aspects of the experience of Ireland, the Irish diaspora as well. We have, primarily we've published teamed multidisciplinary issues, much as this issue is that we're celebrating tonight, but we also have occasionally had non-themed issues, and we will have future non-themed issues as well. So we welcome proposals in either areas. If people here with us today have an idea for a themed issue, please do send me an email. You can email me at any time at rise, R-I-S-E, at EFACIS, EFACIS.eu, and be very happy to consider with the editorial board any recommendations or suggestions for themed issues in the future. We also have a reviews section, and we welcome proposals, suggestions for reviews, or if you've got a book you'd like reviewed, please do contact us. I'm delighted that our reviews editor, Sylvie Mikowski, is with us here today. And you can contact Sylvie at risereviews@efacis.eu if you have a book you'd like reviewed, or if you'd like to contribute indeed as a reviewer. Just one other thing, we also, while we publish primarily in the English language, we also welcome proposals, and indeed we welcome articles written in Irish, and we have published articles previously in the Irish language, but we do ask that there is a slightly longer kind of summary provided to make the work as accessible as possible. So I just wanted to thank at this point the people who make it possible. The editorial board, I mentioned Sylvie Mikowski. We also have Joost Augustine, who's with us this evening as well on the editorial board. We have Elke Doker from KU Leuven. We have our president, Katrina Renhack, from University of Wuppertal, and Daniela Tianova, who's also, I'm delighted to say, is able to join us tonight. And I'm grateful to all of the to the editorial board for their contributions in making this issue and making all of our issues possible. I want to thank in particular our assistant editor, Seán Del Tor, who you can see here, who's also facilitating this launch tonight, for her work in making Rise possible and bringing our issues together. So in introducing tonight's issue, and one of the things that we try to do within Rise, not just that it's multidisciplinary, and this issue certainly is. It brings literature, but it also looks at fiction in Irish language and fiction in English language. It looks at radio, it looks at theatre, but it also looks at a period that kind of made between the 30s and 70s, a period in Irish modern history, which perhaps has not received the attention it deserves in terms of cultural productivity. So that's an important concern of ours, to shine a light on aspects of Irish culture and creativity that perhaps hasn't received due attention. And I'm really grateful to the editors of this issue for the work that they've done in bringing together this, what I think is a really, really strong number in the Rise Journal series. And I'm going to hand you over now. I'm just going to introduce the editors who are going to introduce the issue, and also going to introduce the contributors to the issue. So the editors are Yi-Shi Wu, and Yi-Shi Wu is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the University of Leuven. He's a former postdoctoral researcher at Taiwan's Academia Sinica and an Irish Research Council postgraduate scholarship awardee at the University College Cork. He's interested in modern Irish literature, periodical studies, and print culture studies, and has had work published in the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies, Irish University Review, New Hibernia Review, Irish Studies Review, and Studies in Contemporary Fiction, among other venues. And the co-editor of this issue is Phyllis Boumans, and Phyllis is a part-time fixed-term lecturer at Uppsala University. She holds a PhD from KU Leuven, and her PhD is focused on this period, which this issue is concerned with, the mid-20th century period, focused particularly on literature, periodical culture, short fiction studies, and gender studies. She's published, again, in a wide range of journals, including Irish University Review, New Hibernia Review, and Irish Studies Review, and is also the co-editor of The Writer's Torch, Reading Stories from the Bell, which was published by Stinging Fly in 2023. She's currently co-editing the Edinburgh Companion of Irish Literature and Periodical Culture, which will be published in 2025. And I know there'll be a lot of interest, including from myself, in that particular publication when it appears in 2025. So I'm going to hand over now to Phyllis and Yen-Chi to introduce the issue and the various contributors with us today.
Thank you, Seán, for that introduction. I would also like to take this opportunity, and I'm speaking for my co-editor Yen-Chi here as well, to thank first of all the contributors for choosing to submit their work with RISE. We feel very lucky and fortunate to have had the pleasure of working with you and to have been able to contribute to the publication of your work. We'd also like to thank Seán as general editor of RISE, as well as the editorial board at RISE for their advice, and of course the peer reviewers for their generous feedback and enormously helpful insights and suggestions, and of course a big thank you to Seán, assistant editor at RISE, for proofreading, organising this launch, and for all our hard work. But before I introduce our first speaker, which will be Kate, I just want to give a kind of general introduction to the issue, briefly outline its wider aims, but I'll try to keep it brief. So the issue came about kind of out of our mutual interest in mid-20th century literature, and it builds on the recent critical scholarship that has sought to kind of overturn the previously dominant perception of mid-20th century Irish literary culture as kind of a creative valley locked in between, on the one hand, the revivalist and modernist successes in the early 20th century, and then the spike of literary creativity in the 70s, and instead offers a much more nuanced understanding of this period as a time in which contraction meets expansion, a time of rich and creative intellectual energy, as Seán just said. So this issue is then much indebted to this critical turn, and it seeks to remap Irish literary and cultural landscapes in the middle decades of the 20th century. A period which it defines as roughly coinciding with the conservative years of De Valera's Ireland starting in 1937, up until Ireland's EEC membership in 1973. And it understands literary and cultural landscapes in the broadest terms, so horizontally as a geographic space with borders real and imagined, and vertically, taking its cue from the vertical expansion of the new modernist studies as a space in which high and low cultures clash, commingle, and come together. Taken together, the essays in the issue bear witness to a much richer tapestry of literary modes in mid-century writing that has only recently come into sharper focus, and they contribute to existing scholarship that recognises the flowering of the domestic late Irish modernism at mid-century, in which ideological engagement and formal experiment were no strange bedfellows. And to give you an idea of the different contributions, of what the different contributions collectively achieve, the issue draws our attention to the affordances of the recent reappraisal of Irish masculinity studies from mid-century studies, as we will see later in Loic's work. Moon Young shows us what can be gained from studying mid-century Irish theatre from a transnational feminist perspective that draws parallels between Ireland and Korea. The issue also reminds us through Kate's essay that reassessing the contours of the mid-20th century cultural landscape is incomplete without taking into consideration the wider media landscape in which Irish writers operated. And thanks to Will, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, the issue alerts us to the role poetic translations can play in problematizing the traditional modernization versus repression diet. With Niall's essay, the issue invites us to reconsider mid-century Irish writers' relationship with modernism and issues of modernity by bringing out a particular strand of rural modernist writing in Ireland. And Cialan highlights the extent to which the changing global geopolitics in mid-century can help us reassess Ireland's position in the often neglected Cold War period. In short, then, the individual contributions, they show us the various forms of border crossing, geographic, linguistic, and generic, that can contribute to a fuller map of Irish literature and culture in this period. But I think the ways in which the issue does this will come across much better through the individual presentations of our contributors. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. Kate will be our first speaker. Kate is Assistant Professor of Digital Art, Ecology and Communication in the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University. Kate specializes in post-colonial environmental justice, cultural analysis, eco-media theory, and post-colonial studies, with a focus on Anglophone Irish, African, and Caribbean literatures and cultures, including diaspora and cultural production in Britain. Kate's first book project draws on literature, film, archival photography, and radio to explore how development projects shape social relations, material landscapes, and cultural production in 20th century Ireland. And you can read more about her work if you visit her website, which is katehoover.org. Kate, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you also to, I'm going to share my screen now so you can see, but I do want to thank the editors, Yenchi and Phyllis, who helped to make this a greater contribution than it was initially when I submitted it, and also whoever the anonymous reviewers are. That was really a wonderful collaboration. So I do want to thank you for that. So I'm excited to talk to you all about my article, Aural Interruptions, the Politics of Sound in Teresa Deevy's Radio Plays, which is my contribution to this RISE issue. So briefly in the next few minutes, I'm just going to talk briefly about who Teresa Deevy is for those who might be less familiar with her work and what's been written about her already, as she's an understudied playwright in a time, as you all already pointed out, is understudied in Irish studies already. And then I'll just situate my own article within that, sort of context and think about how the article is contributing to this idea of remapping mid-century Irish culture. So for folks who don't know, and Moon-Young will probably be talking about Deevy as well. So I hope it's not repetitive, and I hope yeah, that it sets you up well. So Deevy was born in Waterford in the end of the 19th century and died in 1963. And she's a really interesting Irish playwright whose trajectory shifted when she was 19 because she became deaf from Meniere's disease when she traveled to London then to learn to lip read and began going to plays. And from her own writing, just reflective on her work, she pointed out at that time that that's when she wanted to start writing plays about Irish life and putting it on the Irish stage. And she was very prolific. She had 6 plays produced on the Abbey theatre stage in the 1930s. But after the more conservative sort of 1937 Constitution and Ernst Blythe taking over the Abbey Theatre directorship, she was gradually marginalized from the National Theatre stage and found it increasingly difficult to get her work produced on stage. So she began to write for radio, which is really interesting given that she did become deaf in 1913, so she would never have actually heard radio, let alone radio plays. But she does really interesting things in her radio plays with sound. And my article is building on some of that work, though that's also an understudied aspect of Deevy's work. Her work was quite difficult actually to access for quite some time. Eileen Carney did her dissertation on Deevy at the University of Oregon, actually, which is where I did my graduate work. So she did that in the 1980s. And actually traveled to Landscape, which is that house you see in the background there, where Deevy spent most of her life, where she was born. And Carney interviewed family members as well as went through archival material and created a really important document. She never published it as a book, but it's still quite important scholarship on Deevy that Cuileagáin has since built on, publishing numerous articles on the strong female protagonists of Deevy's stage plays. And it's only recently in Emily Bloom's work that scholars have begun thinking about Deevy's unique engagement with media and how as a deaf woman, she was actually creating different strategies for engaging with the expanding Irish media landscape in the mid-century. Jonathan Bank, John P. Harrington, and Christopher Morash published these volumes in 2017, which has made Deevy's work more accessible. And most of her work is no longer at Landscape, but it's actually digitized and housed at Maynooth University. So it's much more accessible. My article, Aural Interruptions, is building on all of these scholars' work. So I draw on the gender studies elements of Cuileagáin's work, but I bring a more ecofeminist lens to the connections between sound and space in Deevy's work. And I'm drawing on Emily Bloom's work on Irish radio modernism, but bringing in some sound studies or building on some sound studies there to really explore how Deevy is engaging with gendered narrative forms, in particular naturalism, realism, modernism, how she's kind of playing with and reworking those forms to redefine gendered public and private spaces and spheres, and thinking about the gendering of media, of print versus radio in kind of tension with like oral traditions, but also print culture. So I focus in my article on 4 of Deevy's plays. As you can see, these were written across almost the entirety of the mid-century that is explored in this issue. So there's different things that come actually to the fore in these 4 plays. These are actually ones that scholars believe to have been written specifically for radio, though Deevy actually adapted many of her stage plays for radio, and also some of her radio plays she adapted for stage. So some of the manuscripts actually have kind of an interesting mix of stage directions or sound directions, or or kind of overlapping ones. But my article focuses on these 4 plays to really think about how sound elements are drawing out elements of realism and naturalism. So in particular, I see in Dignity and within Marble City, how Deevy is really reworking realism and naturalism to highlight the ways in which those forms were limiting women's agency in the 1930s and 40s. And Deevy takes a little bit of a modernist turn in her later radio plays, with Going Beyond Alma's Glory and One Look and What It Led To, which reflect much more on the materiality of sound and the materiality of radio and the medium of radio to point to a more splintered and modernist multiplicity of women's self-determination. So ultimately, I argue that Deevy's radio dramas revise and expand understandings of Irish naturalisms, realisms, and modernisms as they establish an overlooked feminist Irish radio modernism. And this is building on Emily Bloom's work in which she wrote a book about Irish radio modernism, but not so much about the women's engagement with radio at that time. So just to kind of conclude here, I think that this particular engagement with radio that Deevy's plays show is really saying something about the material, media and cultural landscapes of mid-century Ireland. They're definitely, she's kind of reworking a lot of them. And as Cuileágáin Nevechan's work also points out, a lot of the backgrounds and the places, the diegeses, if you will, of these plays often point to changing environments, advancing technologies, including media technologies that are proliferating alongside many of Deevy's plays. So I think there's a lot more to explore. So I'm hopeful that my article in this RISE contribution also contributes to just rethinking media landscapes alongside material landscapes in mid-century Ireland. So that's my talk. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward to the Q&A, and I've also included my email in case anyone wants to reach out. So thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Kate. That was great. Our next speaker is Loic Wright. Loic is a lecturer in Irish literature and Irish popular culture at the International School of Business in Dublin and University College Dublin. He holds a joint honours bachelor's degree in English and Spanish and a master's degree in Anglo-Irish literature and culture from University College Dublin. He completed his Irish Research Council funded PhD on Masculinities in Mid-20th Century Irish Fiction at UCD in 2023. And his research interests include Irish literature and popular culture, post-colonial studies, cultural studies, and gender studies. And with that, I hand over to you, Loic.
Thank you very much, Phyllis, and thank you very much again, she and the entire editorial team at RISE. It's been quite a fun project to be involved with. Just to even see the amount of overlap that other researchers have with your own work is always quite heartening and encouraging. I'm going to talk today about my article, which is Reimagining Subversive Masculinities in J.P. Donleavy's The Ginger Man and John Broderick's The Pilgrimage. And as Phyllis mentioned, my work, my research area, and my upcoming monograph with Routledge is directed towards masculinity studies in Irish culture and specifically in Irish fiction. And the reason for this is because masculinity, certainly in the early 20th century and throughout much of the mid-century, is one of the most manipulated topics and concepts that we see in Irish literature, and often that we don't see because it was so adeptly manipulated as well. So for a certain amount of background and context, the idea behind such a rigid and rigorous culture of censorship a lot of the times in the mid-century is designed to curtail any deviations you would have seen in popular culture of a state-sanctioned image of an ideal post-colonial Irish masculinity, when considering that for so long reigning British colonial logic was that Irish men were inept for self-determination because they were not achieving the British aristocratic ideal of civility and democracy. And this was obviously the logic with which self-determination was withheld from Irish people. So obviously after the partition of the country in 1922 and a form of self-determination was granted, to combat these images was particularly important, to show the Irish men as being particularly strong and adept for self-determination. But this is obviously where we start to get this idea of the mid-century as being this fallow period in Irish fiction, something we've obviously touched on already a few times in this presentation. This idea that it lacks the rigor and the innovation of the revival period, partly because so much is banned during this period. I mean, between 1951 and 1955, upwards of 1,300 books are submitted to the censorship board and around 900 are banned, oftentimes for a single sentence, as we know with the case of Kate O'Brien's The Land of Spices. So part of this article is designed to undermine this idea of the fallow period and to show how many writers were in fact attempting to discuss masculinities, but also to do it in experimental ways with new forms of literature perhaps, or manipulating popular forms of the time. And I picked J.P. Donleavy because Donleavy has something of a cult following. Many Dubliners will have perhaps read The Ginger Man, but it doesn't always feature prominently in critical discourse. And John Broderick then is something of the inverse. John Broderick is the example of, when people think of censorship in Ireland and Irish fiction, they often think of Edna O'Brien and John McGahern, who became infamous. But there's also the other side of the coin, which is those who were banned out of existence. That is to say, obviously, John Broderick and Nora Holt is another example, who had about 10 novels banned. So those who get the badge of honor of infamy, and those who are kind of removed from the official history books. And so my analysis in this article is designed to see how John Broderick was very much indebted to a French European tradition, very much influenced by Flaubert and Balzac, which is perhaps why he was so welcomed in France upon the publication of The Pilgrimage in 1961. It was instantly translated into Le Pèlerinage and very quickly became quite popular, whereas in Ireland he's still relatively unknown because he was banned. And then J.P. Donleavy, with his kind of picaresque story of Sebastian Dangerfield, the destructive wannabe Trinity College law student who drinks and fights, becomes this moral excavation of how mid-century ideals and suffocating ideals of Irish masculinity could very much erase the individual, and the kind of detrimental impact that had on male characters. So this is where my analysis rests, and I start the article with some quotes from various regional newspapers such as the Western People, but also more national papers such as the Irish Times and the Irish Independent, who regularly published these opinion pieces on the fears of where Irish masculinity was heading. And this was by no means a new thing. Even as early as the 1900s, Standish O'Grady, the great pioneer of the Gaelic revival, was publishing articles about men who sat for a living, who were exchanging their masculine attributes for acquired feminine ones. So it is hopefully showing this wider trend in 20th century Ireland and Irish culture over the fears of how masculinity was this marker of the health of the nation, and how it needed to be manipulated to show that we were in fact adept for self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Loic. Just keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to move on quickly to the next speaker. So the next essay in the issue is actually by Will Fleming, who recently received his PhD from University College Dublin, where he now also teaches at the English department. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but we still wanted to give you an impression of his work. So I'll just try to outline the essay's main argument. So Will's essay draws our attention to the meaning of poetic translation from Irish into English in the context of post-Lemass era Ireland, and specifically the ways in which translations became entangled with new economic models of progress and nationalism. In his essay, Fleming studies the reception and compositional evolution of two translations from Middle Irish, Thomas Kinsella's The Taun and Trevor Joyce's The Poems of Sweeney Peregrine, through the lens of Raymond Williams' concepts of residual nationalism. And he shows how these works were either co-opted and harnessed by the hegemonic version of nationalism for political gain, or sought to subvert it. And in his perceptive readings, Fleming arrives at a more complex and nuanced view of the old dichotomy between traditionalism, nationalism, and repression on the one hand, and post-nationalism and modernization on the other hand. And in doing so, the article contributes to a growing body of historiographic scholarship, which has argued for a more differentiated and variegated understanding of social change in the 1960s and 70s, and specifically emphasizes the role played by cultural production and translations in these processes. It's a fascinating and well-argued essay, so I can only encourage everyone to read it for themselves. And with that, I hand over to Yenchi, who will introduce our next speaker.
So I have a pleasure of introducing the next three contributors. And the first one is Niall Cuileagáin. And I hope I say his name right. So if I say that wrong, please forgive me. Okay, Niall completed his PhD at University College London in 2022. His first monograph, entitled James Joyce, Rural Ireland and Modernity Beyond the Pale, is forthcoming from Edinburgh University Press, This work interrogates Joyce's depiction of matters rural in the Ireland of his time, complicating the traditional image of Joyce as a writer solely concerned with the urban metropolis. He has published his research in the 2019 Joyce Studies in Italy journal and the 2023 Dublin James Joyce Journal, and has presented at 2 James Joyce symposia, along with being a guest speaker at the 2023 Dublin James Joyce Summer School. And his contribution is titled A Joycean's Mudmonger, Echoes of Joyce in Martin O'Kine's Rural Modernism. Okay, and I will give a brief introduction to this essay. This essay engages with the ways in which the new modernist studies offers new paradigms in which to reconsider mid-century Irish writers' relationships with modernism and the issues of modernity. Drawing on the idea of rural modernism and rural modernity, Niall offers a compelling study of Martin O'Kine, examining the ways in which O'Kine's Cuileagáin complicates James Joyce's modernist legacies. His essay shows a mid-century Irish landscape where the uneasy tensions of traditional modernity and of rural-urban, unduly isolationist narrative gesturing towards a new understanding of an Irish iteration of rural modernism. So our next speaker is Moon Young Hong. Moon Young is visiting assistant professor in English at City University of Hong Kong. She specializes in Irish literature with an MPhil in Irish writing and a PhD in English from Trinity College Dublin. Her articles have appeared in Irish Studies Review, Comparative Drama, Etudes Irlandaises, and the Yes Journal of Korea. She is author of Tom Murphy's Theatre of Everyday Space, which is under contract with the Routledge, and co-editor of The Irish Pub, Invention and Reinvention, which is under contract with Cork University Press. And the title of her essay is Women Playwrights at the Crossroads, a comparative study of Ireland and Korea in the mid-20th century. And I think Moon Young is based in Hong Kong, which is very early right now, so thank her for joining us. Now I will hand over to Moon Young.
Yes, it's coming up to 1:38 a.m. in Hong Kong, but thank you so much for having me today, and I'm really honored to be part of this issue, and huge thanks to the editors, Phyllis and Yenchi, and the reviewers for all your help in the process, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. So I've always been interested in the historical and cultural parallels between Korea and Ireland. So on the slides, you actually see here that even the size of South Korea and Ireland is similar, although South Korea has 10 times the population of Ireland, 50 million. Anyways, aside from the size of the two places, there are many historical parallels. Korea having been colonized by Japan, Ireland being Britain's oldest colony. There's the Civil War and the Korean War that followed soon after independence, and then the rapid modernization that led to the Asian and Celtic tigers. In fact, I read that Korea, Ireland, and Poland are 3 countries that have become richer than their former colonizers at some point. So while on different timelines, the fact that even today there's the issue of the border with Northern Ireland and North Korea often occupying political headlines, lots of interesting connections can be drawn from these countries, particularly in regard to the debate on modernity and modernization in the mid-20th century. What's problematic, however, is that often these grand narratives about the nation are deeply patriarchal, with women's voices being absent, erased, and forced into positions of devoted wives and mothers in the service of their newly forged nation. Ideas of motherhood in particular were emphasized, where women were symbols of their nations and objects of ideology in ways that perpetuated their subordinate status. And here are 2 examples, representative figures from Ireland and Korea, Kathleen Ni Houlihan and Shin Saim-dang. Kathleen you all know very well, but Shin was a Korean artist from Joseon period in the 16th century. She is foremost an artist, but for very long, she was mainly known for being the wise mother of the Confucian scholar Yi. So motherhood was often used as a tool for the formation and growth of the nation state. So my article was prompted by Dr. Yenchi Wu's invitation. He mentioned that in remapping the mid-20th century, there was lack of scholarship about women and about drama and theatre. And I think something about these two absences already signaled a connection between the genre and industry of theatre and women's place in history. As I point out in my article, in both countries, the theatre scene was dominated by male-centered customs and practices and was closed off to women theatre makers, particularly women as producers. I was curious about how these women, although from very different cultural contexts, navigated these multiple barriers, especially theatre being regarded as a public domain of art, and women's roles were often limited in these public spheres. So initially it was going to be a wider survey paper. So I had over 10 playwrights I wanted to compare, which of course is impossible to fit in one essay. So I had to cut down to 4, Deevy, as Dr. Kate Huber has kindly illustrated very well for us, Laverty, Kim, and John. And I've grouped them under 2 main themes. One is regarding women's writing about the state of the nation, and the other to think about the changing cityscapes, so Dublin and Seoul. Comparing women playwrights at a time when their nations were at the crossroads, I look at the various strategies these writers employed, thematically in their works and practically as authors and theatre makers, furthering the discourse on feminism and modernity. And just to give a few examples, both Deevy and Kim foreground women's everyday emotional and sexual desire. In Katie Roach, Deevy deconstructs de Valera's grand narratives of progress and development of nation states. She explores the shadow of such grandness, the violence it enacts on women who are left out of these hegemonic narratives or are positioned to legitimize state and church ideologies. Deevy's world-making foregrounds Katie and her coming of age as a critique of the silent aspects of the nation and modernity. The Immigrant Ship is Kim's first epic play with more than 28 characters on stage. Again, very experimental. The play depicts a farming community in Korea seeking to make money abroad by moving to Brazil. The play does not show the life of Korean immigrants in Brazil. Rather, it focuses on the lead up of their departure from Korea and the thoughts of and conflicts within the community about to embark on the ship. The story dramatizes the breakdown of the family and the disillusionment and incompleteness of the utopia that's symbolized by Brazil. And these are just a few more examples from Laverty and John, where I look at the problems of urbanization and how the changing cityscapes affect women. And this is from Tolka Row, part of the Dublin inner city tenement trilogy. You really see the kind of slum living conditions. And this is to show how Seoul also changed rapidly, dividing Gangbuk and Gangnam, literally the north and south of Han River, and with its apartments and complex buildings. John portrays characters who are marginalized on these fringes of modernity, such as children, the elderly, domestic workers, and the mentally ill. And as I argue, all of these women exhibit sensitivity towards the marginalized and uses the aesthetics of the everyday to offer political critique, making valuable contribution to dramatic literature and in the ongoing global literary conversation. So ultimately, to conclude, placing Irish literature in a global context while viewing it from a feminist perspective helps us remap the intersections and interconnections of women's struggles and achievements across borders. This transnational feminist framework expands and complicates the Irish literary landscape, providing insights into the evolving nature of Irish cultural expression in an era of global modernity. Thank you.
Thank you, Moon-Young. And our last presenter is Keelan Hawken, who's joining us from Canada. Keelan is Assistant Professor of Irish Literature at Concordia University. His forthcoming first book considers the relationship between the novel, citizenship, and constitutionality in Ireland. His current research project interrogates how Irish writers of the 1930s negotiated and reimagined issues of statehood through their fiction. With publications in journals such as Irish University Review, Textual Practice, and New Hibernian Review, Keelan has written on several Irish writers, including Tom O'Flaherty, Kate O'Brien, Mary Mannan, Flann O'Brien, Dorothy Mercado, and Anne Enright. And the title of his contribution is Cuileagáin Won't Know Itself, William Trevor's The Ballroom of Romance as Cold War Fiction. Okay, now I hand it over to Keelan.
All right, thanks, Yan-Chi, and thanks, Phyllis, and everyone involved in bringing the issue together and today's presentation. Yeah, so this essay, Cuileagáin Won't Know Itself, William Trevor's Ballroom of Romance is Cold War Fiction, is kind of my first real foray into a new research project that I'm pursuing, which is looking to examine Irish writers and how they've engaged with the Cold War. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the general reaction I have solicited when I tend to talk about this project idea is one of puzzlement. I have a funny story about Tinashe Micheál Martin in this regard if someone wants to ask me the Q&A, but and largely that is because the Republic of Ireland's official position in the Cold War has, as it is and continues to this day in global conflicts, is one of neutrality. But I mean, even as kind of recent international events show us, neutrality hardly amounts to simple isolation, which is a word, of course, as we've come to kind of discuss already, that's been long associated with Irish society and Irish politics in the mid-20th century. The very nature of the Cold War, as George Orwell kind of phrased it, the peace that is no peace in his 1946 essay, You and the Atom Bomb, between the United States and the Soviet Union, kind of highlights the degree to which an official policy of neutrality cannot always equate to voluntary exemption. It's an either-or world now, as Seán O'Faolain put it in his 1951 essay, Auto-Anti-Americanism. And when both the either and the or have nuclear bombs, neutrality is a bit complicated, as the crisis in Chernobyl kind of makes evident. Nuclear fallout doesn't really care very much about our imagined borders. Even the very question of Irish neutrality as a blanket policy has been troubled in the past 2 decades by historians like Jerome Andeville, Bernadette Whelan, Paula Wiley. There's acts of international recognition with Czechoslovakia, China, diplomacy of small statecraft, particularly in decolonizing Western Africa, and of course changes to economic policy in Ireland in the mid-20th century. That kind of show that Ireland was very much still part and parcel to the global ideological conflict between American capitalism and Soviet communism. So the aim of my project and this essay, my contribution to this issue, is to consider how mid-century Irish literature as a part of the broader kind of cultural imagination sort of further complicates our understanding of the impact that the Cold War might have had on or in Ireland. Admittedly, I've chosen one of the more contextually difficult texts to explore in this kind of first essay, establishing the broader project. I mentioned in the essay that when we talk about Cold War fiction, we're usually thinking about nuclear brinksmanship or espionage, John le Carré, Dr. Strangelove, all that kind of stuff, rather than the local gossip enervating a tired rural dance hall in Ireland, as in the case of William Trevor's The Ballroom of Romance. So there are more immediately obvious examples that I could have chosen as part of my project. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'll be alongside Yan-Chi on a panel at ACES talking about John McGahern's Korea and Sierra Leone, which involve, of course, the Korean War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I thought maybe my presentation could just be why I chose to talk about The Ballroom of Romance instead of these other texts. And quite simply, the reason is because this is where the sort of seed of the idea came from. I've taught The Ballroom of Romance many times, and of course the issue of Americanization has come up many times, both when I'm teaching it, but in existing scholarship on the story. But about kind of 2 years ago, I happened to be teaching it in a week where I was just kind of on YouTube listening as I was kind of cooking away in my kitchen to an interview by a scholar who was talking about American influence in South American kind of economic policy during the Cold War. I cannot remember who that person was, and I cannot find a link on YouTube, so apologies to them in the ether of academia. But I was kind of struck as I was listening to this interview, while also thinking about, preparing my notes and lecture slides and all of that stuff. by the kind of similarities in terms of the historical context, in terms of the economic context between what they were talking about in terms of South America in the Cold War era and Irish economic policy in the mid-20th century under the likes of Seán Boumans. Now, obviously, the CIA did not install Seán Boumans as a dictator in Ireland. But nonetheless, I was sort of really struck by how much something like the first program of economic reform under Lamas and T.K. Whitaker was obviously the one who wrote it, very much aligned with these kind of prevailing political currents of a globalizing Cold War world. Now, that would all be for naught if the Ballroom of Romance was something of kind of an outlier or one-off example of these kinds of tensions appearing in mid-century Irish literature. As I mentioned, John McGahern's stories like Korea and Sierra Leone suggest there are others. And in fact, as I started thinking about this more, the more that these kinds of issues and tensions start to appear. In fact, I taught a course this past fall, a new course, undergraduate seminar on Cold War writing, where we looked at the likes of Mary Lavin's The Shrine, which has this sort of undercurrent of economic development in relation to kind of religious tensions. And that starts from 1970 something, I think. Samuel Beckett's plays, even The Long-Winded Lady, Maeve Brennan's writing in the New Yorker, often talks about like Vietnam War protests and stuff like that. So it starts to kind of appear everywhere. And so when you're kind of reading Irish literature in the context of, say, the cultural turn in Cold War studies, you start to kind of notice these patterns develop that have been otherwise broached by scholars in the field of even, say, Global South literature. My former colleague, who unfortunately passed away in February, Monica Popescu, has a great body of work on this regard. So basically, I'm kind of thinking about how these questions of Americanization, of economic policy, that has been explored in the context of Irish literature, how it might actually speak to a kind of, or let us think about Irish literature in this kind of broader network of a mid-century cultural production on a kind of global stage. So just to kind of wrap up, yeah, my essay is a kind of first attempt to sort of pose questions about how a global, all-encompassing dynamic like the Cold War might compel us to reconsider how we understand the cultural imagination of Ireland, about Ireland, or of Irish writers in the mid-20th century. And I just want to say, you know, in this regard, I'm very much indebted to historians and sort of sociologists who have done lots of work in this regard, as well as literary scholars who, in the past couple of decades, who have really sort of turned our attention to international, transnational perspectives, but also very much indebted to the work of Yenchi and Phyllis and the readers who have been very sort of generous in their comments, kind of figuring out how to frame this, because it's not a particularly well-worn path, I suppose, in terms of thinking about Irish literature. So it really helped me kind of think about just not only how we situate the story in this kind of context, but also how I might sort of think about situating the project and sort of explaining that approach. So thank you to all of you, and I'm looking forward to our further discussion.
Thank you, Keelan. And I think now we have 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, please raise your hand.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So thank you all. This was really interesting. It's exciting to be part of this issue. But I guess my question now is for Munyong, because I really enjoyed reading your essay. I think, we have similar interests just from like thinking about mid-century women playwrights. But I'm curious because I did notice in my own essay as Deevy went into a more modernist element in some of her later work, that she actually did seem to be addressing more transnational feminist issues than specifically Irish ones, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I'm curious if you also found in your research kind of that that playwrights were focusing more on the local, but also actually making more global claims about sort of, and I think this might also connect with Luke's essay on masculinity, but just sort of actually thinking about these phenomena that are, happening in a specific way in Ireland, but actually they're not just specific to Ireland. Like there were post-colonial masculinities as well that, came in a similar pattern of sort of emasculation and then patriarchy that some of Moon Young and my work is addressing through Irish and South and Korean women playwrights. So yeah, I'm just curious, Moon Young, if you noticed that there was like a branching out, and I guess if Luke, if you want to comment too, I'd be curious. Sort of this, I really am interested in this shift to transnational thinking and sort of, I guess Keelan's work also in sort of globalizing, what was happening in mid-century Ireland, but.
Absolutely. Thank you for that comment and question. In fact, I think part of the barriers that women face was precisely this kind of bias or prejudice that women write very local or parochial or everyday domestic writing. But in fact, actually, that in itself can be quite a transnational, universal concern, in fact. And I think, as you say, what we do by scholarly addressing these issues is actually not only branching out and expanding towards the transnational, but looking at the local in itself as a kind of transnational perspective. So there's also an interesting turn, as you say, with Teresa Deevy. She actually turns to very religious, very spiritual theme in her late career. And actually there's another playwright that I wasn't able to mention who also has a very similar trajectory. And I'm still kind of grappling with what this spiritual turn towards their late career means. But yeah, there's definitely a kind of transnational interest in these women's works. Or Loic had something to say about the transnational perspective.
I see, Joyce, do you have a hand up there? Do you want to come out with a question?
Sure, yeah, I wanted to pick up a little bit on Keelan's point, and also on this notion of comparison between Ireland and Korea. So as I'm coming up from this as an historian, right, and as a non-Irish person, so that draws me to pose two questions which are very general, so that anybody can answer it or not answer it. I don't know. One is the periodization, so as an Irish historians would say, well, the war period or the emergency is very different from the post-war period, and then the Valera period is very different from the Lamaze period. So even if you look at Irish periodization of history, then the notion of a 1930s, 1970s period as a one issue, as something that ties together. So I wonder a little bit about that notion, and whether the editors probably be best ones to answer that question. How do you define that period as being one period with one particular characteristic that ties it together? And the other issue is the one thing that, as an Irish historian, I've been complaining to other Irish historians a lot about, because they tend to think that everybody who reads their work knows everything about Ireland, and so you don't have to explain things. What is a Taoiseach, for God's sake, or something like that. So taking that up is a little bit that there is might be a tendency to think that all developments or all expressions of Irish writers is informed by the Irish context. So Keelan has been talking about the Cold War as a very external influence on how people view things. So to what extent can you explain the developments in each paper and what is being described? To what extent is it informed by solely the Irish context, or also by the international context? And of course, in the 70s, you have the second wave of feminism, which may well affect some of the writers here. So those are just two aspects that I'm thinking of, and that might address anybody can address maybe the questions in some form.
Any volunteers? Anybody want to?
I can try an effort.
Look,
Not an effort. It was a really good question. Sorry, that came off. That's not what I meant. Well, I guess in some ways, one of the things I was thinking about is the kind of, I don't know if fluidity is quite the right word, but thinking about how in the context of something like the ballroom of romance, where you have these sort of characters who, I mean, the ballroom is sort of described as being kind of marooned in the middle of sort of bogland. It's just sort of out there. It's very starkly there. And it's so it comes across as very sort of isolated. But then you start getting into sort of all of these networks of sort of cultural influence that suggest that all of these things are interconnected, right? So a character like Bridie wants to go to the cinema. What's playing in the cinema? American films. Her father reads, Wild West novels. But then even thinking about our economic policy and how that informs the gossip of the people at the dance hall, thinking that the Americans are going to invest in a cement factory, right? It's all of these things in which the idea of kind of what's going on in this very kind of localized way is sort of impossible to disentangle from these broader networks because the nature of the world is sort of broader. So I think this is, I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I think this is kind of, it's about these sort of networks that influence all of these different things. So it's not that the Irish context is the Irish context and the Cold War context is the Cold War context, is that those things coincide and they exist together at the same time. And I'll stop ranting. Sorry.
Maybe to come in about your question of the periodization, I don't think that the issue wants to kind of suggest that, that we can periodize this period. I think what we instead try to do is try to show the kind of different strands of writing that have been neglected of this period. So for example, Loic's essay, for example, draws attention to the ways in which there was actually engagement with the angry young men movement or the picturesque movement, or and Kate's essay looks at the ways in different forms of naturalism and realism, etc. So I think it's kind of, the idea is not to periodize, but rather to show that how variegated the type of writing that is being done in this period actually is, to counter this kind of narrative of a fallow creative period. Does that make sense at all?
yeah, absolutely.
And maybe to say something briefly about the Korea connection, it's actually really interesting that Korean writers had very limited understanding of Irish culture. So often they would appropriate parts of Irish culture in a way that was useful for Korea's own agenda. So for instance, Seán O'Casey is quite big in Korea because of the kind of themes he was exploring. Even though Koreans had no idea of the kind of actual peasant life, they would use this as a kind of nationalist play and would often adapt it into the Korean context. So I think actually it's really interesting, rather than setting the Irish culture as the default timeline by which to look at others as an external force, that to flip the paradigm and see it from this perspective is actually quite interesting. Yeah, that was just a short comment.
Absolutely. Victoria, you're very welcome there.
Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to reading your pieces after having that first introduction there. I'm myself interested in landscapes, having just actually taught on Irish landscapes in the Irish culture just earlier on today, and it makes me think I've been talking about the term landscape, and from having listened to, have I understood that you're trying to put this kind of period on the landscape themselves. So I would like to hear more from all of you. What's the remapping that you're doing? What's the mapping that you've done, and what's the remapping of your individual pieces? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Any volunteers there?
I
Kate?
can start maybe yeah, feel free to jump in at any point. Yeah, no, that's a great question actually, and I don't know. Yeah, I guess I work mostly in the environmental humanities, so I publish a lot about Ireland, but often in journals like Aural or Green Letters and things, and I think so I'm quite interested in actually how material landscapes are shaped by culture and how culture is shaping material landscapes. So with my piece, really, I'm thinking a lot about, and this might speak to some of what Keelan was talking about, but I look a lot at modernization and how that's kind of aestheticized, like what progress looks like, what is modernity. And at a certain point when Deevy was writing these radio plays, radio was very modern, and she died in 1963, so she was really like right at this time when things were shifting to television being more modern, and then there's a different kind of idea, but media is often something that is both incredibly environmental, but it's also, I mean, just in its, you have to have electromagnetic fields to even hear, to transmit radio, and you also, it takes an incredible amount of resources out of the ground, so it's like physically shaping environments, but it's also shaping kind of the way that we think about environments and space in particular, like when you can, how far you can transmit information, or who's actually listening, or which voices are in your living room. So I think there's these kind of tensions that really shape domestic and like public space. So, and there's this very gendered element there. And it's interesting because, yeah, as Moon Young pointed out, Deevy's later works become incredibly religious. And so one look in what it led to, the fourth play that I examine in my article is actually about Mary Magdalene. But she does these really interesting things, talking about sound and, well, this is my argument anyway. She's tapping into the medium of radio at the end of this play through the engagement with the air. And Douglas Kahn has written about that, about how radio is very dependent on the air and these things, which gave it its kind of modernist splintering that was different from what she had done earlier in her career with realism and naturalism. So I think for me, maybe being so entrenched in the environmental humanities, everything is material, everything is a relationship with land in some way. So yeah, and that landscapes are always being, you know, sort of manipulated by how we have a relationship with them. So yeah, so I guess that would be my answer. I suppose it's kind of rambling, and I'm curious what other folks have to say, but that's kind of my first response. Thanks for the question.
I guess I'll jump in here briefly. From my perspective, the idea of mapping and remapping is very much based on looking at fiction as a soft power, and the idea of how much it was, again, as I said, controlled, what could make its way into the hands of the reading public, in case, for the examples of John Broderick, certainly, and J.P. Donleavy, a text which perhaps even promoted or just showed alternative forms of masculinity were deprived out of the hands of the Irish reading public. But also worth considering examples like John McGahern, who not only had their texts banned, but also lost their jobs as a result. Just how much, obviously, you think of Brinsley McNamara, who had copies of Valley of the Squinting Windows burned in his village. Just how much, for my work, it's a case of trying to uncover what were the official state teachings on an ideal post-colonial masculinity, and how was that measured? How was that achieved? Well, it was a delicate balance, I guess, of carrot and stick, keeping things out of people's hands and then letting them read what you wanted them to read, for the most part. So a lot of that also comes down to finding books that have been very difficult to find, a very kind of paratextual level. The copy of The Pilgrimage I have is from 1975. And it's difficult enough to find those texts, as I'm sure many people will attest. And it's also, with that, brings these questions of kind of deconstructing images of mid-century Ireland as this very isolationist period. I mean, economically, maybe isolationist policies, fine, they abound, but you look at some texts like Nora Holt's Farewell Happy Fields talks about the role of the individual in the rise of fascism, and the idea of, you know, your moral duty to your country obviously gets banned. Kate O'Brien's Farewell Spain and even Mary Lavelle talk about Spanish culture and the onslaught of fascism, again banned. So there is this real sense of, and as is evident from everyone's articles in this collection, we've kind of only scratching the surface on what the mid-century really was about, because so much of it was kind of silenced in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point I think you've made. And it speaks to why an issue like this is so important. You are shining a light on those areas that have been fortunately neglected and overlooked in the scholarship. We're nearly out of time. We're actually gone over time. So I'm conscious of that. And we could indeed go on for much longer. It's been a really fascinating session. I've thoroughly enjoyed all of the contributions and the questions. So thank you to everybody who's been here with us this evening, to all the speakers, to all the contributors, to the editors, to Phyllis and Yenchi on bringing this wonderful issue together, and for your contributions here tonight. To Seán, our assistant editor, for all of her work and advice and in this process. To the editorial board, and to those members that could join us, to Juice, to Daniela, to Sylvie. Kathy was here briefly, but unfortunately had to leave. She's traveling at the moment, Kathy Renhack. Just a final note to let you know, first of all, this recording will be made available in addition to the issue, which is already available on our Rise website. So please visit the website. You'll find, of course, all of our issues there. Past issues are available at our Rise platform. And these recordings are also available there. We have a forthcoming issue I'll just mention briefly. That's coming up, our next issue in October, November, 7.2, which will be New Identities in 21st Century Irish Writing. It's been edited by Ralph Hakel and Caroline Lusing. So that'll be coming out later this year. And again, we're always very appreciative and of all proposals that we receive. So if you have any ideas for future themed issues, or indeed if you just have an article you'd like us to consider or go through our peer review process, please do contact us at rise@efacis.eu, or if you have got a review or a book you'd like reviewed, risereviews@efacis.eu. And that's it. Thank you all again, and please take care. Good evening, everybody.